This training module is titled Protecting Students from Discrimination in Washington Public Schools. Even though state and federal non-discrimination laws and complaint procedures also apply to school employees, today's focus is on protecting students. You can learn more about employment discrimination and complaint procedures by reviewing our non-discrimination and sexual harassment policies and procedures for employees. All school districts and charter schools must provide students with a learning environment that is free from discrimination. As school employees, we all have a role to play in preventing discrimination. But we can't prevent discrimination unless we recognize what we are looking for. This section will help us better understand the legal definitions of discrimination, discriminatory harassment, and sexual harassment, and learn to distinguish between harassment, intimidation, and bullying, or HIB, and discriminatory harassment. So, let's get started. The first term we need to understand is discrimination, which is generally defined as the unfair or unequal treatment of a person or group because they are part of a protected class. The key thing to remember here is this: there are probably many things that our students experience at school that may feel unfair or unequal. However, to meet the legal definition of discrimination, the unfair or unequal treatment has to be based on or motivated by a protected class. So, what is a protected class? A protected class is a group of people who share common characteristics and who are protected from discrimination under federal and state law. In Washington, the following groups are protected classes under state law: race, color, and national origin, religion and creed, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity and gender expression, disability and use of a trained service animal, and veteran or military service. Two common forms of discrimination that we find in schools involve access to school programs and activities, and discriminatory and sexual harassment. Let's talk about each one in turn, starting with access to school programs and activities. A form of discrimination that we often see in schools is discriminatory harassment. Harassment can become a form of discrimination when it is based on or motivated by protected class and creates a hostile environment. Let's break this down a bit further. Let's start with what is meant by conduct or communication that is based on or motivated by protected class. This can include a wide range of actions and words. For example, graffiti or vandalism on school property, the use of rumors, slurs, or pejoratives, jokes, memes, and videos, threats and intimidation, physical assault. Of course, all these examples can also occur without being based on or motivated by protected class. In that case, they are not discriminatory in nature and would not rise to the level of discriminatory harassment. Instead, they might be considered harassment, intimidation, or bullying, or HIB, which we will talk about in a moment. How can we tell if a student may be experiencing a hostile environment at school? This can sometimes be challenging because no two students are alike. However, there are some common signs that are often present and which we can look for, such as a lack of interest in school or in a preferred class or activity, deteriorating mental or physical health, increased absences or school refusal, more frequent discipline referrals or behavior issues, slipping grades, a desire to avoid certain people or places in the school building. Note that this is not an exhaustive list. We also need to talk about harassment, intimidation, and bullying, or HIB, and its overlap with discriminatory harassment. As school employees, we are all familiar with our school's harassment, intimidation, and bullying, or HIB, policy and procedure, which covers student-on-student bullying based on any characteristic, including protected class. Because there is often overlap between incidents of HIB and discriminatory harassment, it is important to be able to tell the difference between the two, especially if you are someone who has a role in your school's HIB process. 1. The biggest difference between the two is the basis or motivation behind the conduct. As we just talked about, HIB can be based on any characteristic, for example, a student's height or weight, or the brand of clothing they wear. On the other hand, discriminatory harassment involves conduct or communication that is based on a protected class. For example, a student's sex, race, religion, or sexual orientation. 2. Another key difference is that different LEA employees need to be notified. For incidents of HIB, you are going to want to notify the HIB coordinator if they are not already aware. For incidents of discriminatory harassment, you need to notify the Civil Rights Coordinator. 3. Next, different district policies and procedures will apply. For incidents of bullying or harassment that do not involve protected class, the HIB policy and procedure should be applied. That procedure provides for a building-level complaint with a shorter investigative timeline. For incidents of bullying or harassment that do involve protected class, the non-discrimination or sexual harassment policy and procedure should be applied. Both provide for a district-level complaint with a longer investigative timeline. 4. Finally, the scope of the school's response will likely differ. When addressing incidents of HIB, the response is often student-specific and more limited in nature. In other words, the school typically asks, "Did the conduct occur? And if so, how should we discipline the perpetrator?" When addressing incidents of discriminatory harassment, however, the response often needs to be systemic in addition to student-specific. In other words, the school asks, "Did the conduct occur? And if so, how should we discipline the student? And could this incident indicate a broader problem in this school or district?" School employees also need to be able to tell when an incident meets the definition of sexual harassment, which is a form of discriminatory harassment. For purposes of this training, we are going to focus on sexual harassment that occurs between students, and we will use the definition found in state law, which is 1. Unwelcome conduct or communication that is 2. Sexual in nature, and 3. Creates a hostile environment. When analyzing whether sexual harassment may have occurred, we need to start with the first element. Was the conduct or communication unwelcome? Conduct or communication is considered unwelcome if the student did not request or invite it and perceived the conduct as offensive or undesirable. Additional factors to consider are the student's age, the nature and severity of the conduct or communication, and whether the student was capable of welcoming the sexual conduct or communication. Remember, just because a student submits to the conduct or fails to object does not mean that the conduct was welcome. As just one example, consider a situation where a male high school student willingly kisses a female student on one occasion. When he subsequently attempts to kiss her again, she objects, but he kisses her anyway. This subsequent kiss would be considered unwelcome, even though the student welcomed the first kiss. If the conduct was unwelcome, we next analyze the second element, whether it was sexual in nature. For example, touching or grabbing a student's body, catcalling or sexually suggestive whistling, making sexual jokes or remarks, spreading rumors about a student's sexual history, pressuring someone for sexual favors, sending sexually explicit texts, emails, or photos, forcible sexual contact or rape. Finally, we analyze the third element, whether because of the conduct a hostile environment was created for the targeted student or other students. As we covered earlier in the training, a hostile environment is created when conduct is so severe, persistent, or pervasive that it affects a student's ability to participate in or benefit from the school's programs or activities. The second section of this training module is focused on responding to potential discrimination. In other words, if a school employee sees or hears about possible discrimination, what must they do in response? Similarly, if a school receives a discrimination complaint, how should it respond? As school employees, we need to remember that we all have a duty to respond to all potential discrimination, including discriminatory and sexual harassment. The general rule is, once on notice, a school must 1. Investigate to determine what happened and the resulting impact upon students, and 2. If the school finds that discrimination has occurred, it must take prompt and effective steps to stop the conduct, eliminate the hostile environment for the targeted student and any other students impacted, prevent the conduct from recurring, and remedy the effects of the conduct on the targeted student and any other students impacted. The school must take these steps regardless of whether anyone has filed a complaint or asked the school to respond. What does it mean to be on notice? The term on notice is quite broad, meaning any time a school employee knows or should have known about the potential discrimination. For example, a school would be considered on notice when a complaint is received, a student or parent tells a school staff member witnesses the conduct, or a school staff member hears about the conduct indirectly, such as through social media or word of mouth. The bottom line is that if any school employee witnesses or otherwise becomes aware of possible discriminatory harassment, they must promptly notify the Civil Rights Coordinator. The Civil Rights Coordinator will then partner with the administrator in the building where the incident occurred to ensure that a prompt and thorough investigation is conducted, the correct policy and procedure are applied, and that the school's response appropriately addresses the conduct. We have just discussed what to do when a school employee is on notice of potential discrimination, But what do school employees have to do after receiving a discrimination complaint? Before we talk about required responses, let's first distinguish between the two different types of discrimination complaints we could receive. The first is a verbal or informal complaint, and the second is a written or formal complaint. A verbal complaint occurs when a school employee is told about an incident of possible discrimination or discriminatory harassment. Usually, this happens during a phone call or conversation. Note that for verbal complaints alleging sex-based discrimination or harassment, there may be some additional obligations to respond, so make sure to touch base with the Title IX coordinator. A written complaint has a specific legal definition under Washington law. First, it must be in writing. This means it must be sent by mail, fax, email, or hand delivery. It does not need to include the words complaint or discrimination. Second, it must be sent to any school or district administrator. For example, the superintendent, a compliance coordinator, or a principal. Finally, it must allege discrimination. In other words, it must describe specific conduct that, if true, would violate non-discrimination laws, rules, or guidelines. Additionally, the allegations must be specific enough that a reasonable person would understand it to be a complaint and know what to investigate. Importantly, a written complaint can be filed by anyone, including a parent, student, community member, advocate, or employee. The reason why it is important to know whether a discrimination complaint was verbal or written is because the school's required response differs depending upon what type of complaint is received. When any school employee receives a verbal complaint, they must notify the Civil Rights Coordinator. The Civil Rights Coordinator will then partner with the appropriate building administrator to investigate and respond, notify the complainant of their right to file a written complaint, provide the complainant with a copy of the discrimination complaint procedure. When any school employee receives a written complaint, they must notify the Civil Rights Coordinator. The Civil Rights Coordinator will then partner with the appropriate building administrator to apply the LEA's formal discrimination complaint procedure in response. Provide the complainant with a copy of the discrimination complaint procedure. The key distinction here is that in response to a written complaint, the LEA must apply its formal discrimination complaint procedure, which includes different timelines and procedural requirements that must be followed. His chart outlines the discrimination complaint procedure under state law. It is a three-step process. The first step is the complaint to the school district. Once the LEA receives a written discrimination complaint, it must respond using its discrimination complaint procedure. Broadly speaking, this procedure requires the LEA to complete the following actions within 30 calendar days: conduct an investigation, complete an investigative report, and respond in writing to the complainant. The written response must, at a minimum, include an investigative summary, whether a violation was found, any corrective actions put in place, notice of the complainant's right to appeal. The school must send a copy of the written response to OSPI. The second step is the appeal. After receiving the school's written decision, the complainant can choose to file an appeal. In most districts, these types of appeals are sent to the school board. The board has 30 calendar days to consider the appeal and to provide the complainant with a written decision on appeal. At that time, the board must also send a copy of its decision to OSPI. The final step is a complaint to OSPI. After receiving the board's decision on appeal, the complainant can choose to file a complaint with OSPI. OSPI will evaluate the complaint, and if grounds exist to open it, will open it for further investigation. You may remember that earlier, we talked about the differences between HIB and discriminatory harassment. Now, it is time to talk about how to respond to an incident that includes conduct that could meet the definition of HIB and discriminatory harassment. For example, let's say that a principal receives a HIB complaint and notices that the bullying appears to be related to the student's race. What should the principal do next? First, let's compliment the principal for making a critical observation, which is that the bullying appears to be related to a protected class, race. This means that applying the school's HIB procedure is not enough. This HIB complaint also needs to be assessed for civil rights implications. Here is what the principal should do next. First, they should make sure the conduct has stopped and that students are safe. Supportive measures may need to be put in place to ensure student safety. Next, they should notify both coordinators, HIB and civil rights. Finally, they will likely need to partner with the coordinators to ensure that the conduct is properly addressed under both procedures. This concludes this section of our training module. If you have questions or concerns, either now or later, remember that you can always reach out to any of our school's compliance coordinators.